Picture this. A teenager moves from Ukraine to California. He and his mom are living on food stamps, and he's sweeping floors at a grocery store to get by. Fast forward a few years, and he sells his company, WhatsApp, to Facebook. That's Jan Koum.
Or how about this one? A little boy is sent to an orphanage in Milan when he's only 7. His mom's a widow and she just can't afford to raise him. He grows up to create the company that owns Ray-Ban and Oakley, and he becomes the second richest man in all of Italy. That was Leonardo Del Vecchio.
And then, of course, there's the story you've probably heard. A man, homeless, raising his toddler son, sleeping in public bathrooms, all while trying to make it in an unpaid internship at a brokerage firm. You probably know him as Chris Gardner, the man who inspired the movie The Pursuit of Happiness.
These stories, they're incredible, right? They're the foundation of one of the most powerful ideas out there, the rags to riches dream. But here's the big question. How much of that dream is a widespread reality, and how much of it is a really powerful myth? Well, that's exactly what we're going to dig into.
So first, let's just be clear on what we're talking about. The idea of rags to riches isn't just a good plot for a movie. For a lot of people, it's a core belief about how the world is supposed to work.
The definition itself is pretty simple, right? It's just going from being poor to being wealthy. It is the ultimate story of beating the odds with nothing but your own hard work and determination. It's this incredibly inspiring idea that where you start in life doesn't have to decide where you end up. To really get why this idea has such a strong grip on us, let's just go back to Chris Gardner's story. It's kind of the perfect encapsulation of the entire rags to riches narrative.
Think about that for a second. This quote really captures his mindset. He was literally homeless, but he never let anyone at his internship see it. He was projecting the success he was fighting so desperately to achieve.
And wow, what a journey that was. This wasn't some lucky break. It was a brutal, step-by-step grind. His only way in was an unpaid position, zero income. And then his life completely falls apart. For a whole year, he and his little boy don't have a stable home. And yet, he kept going, passed his exam, and just a few years later, he founded his own multi-million-dollar company. It is just an absolutely staggering story. It's an amazing story, no doubt, but it forces us to ask a really tough question. Is this kind of incredible leap normal? Or are we just focusing on the rare, super dramatic exceptions?
Okay, so now let's move from the inspiring stories and put the dream to the test. Let's look at the cold, hard data on social mobility. So here it is, the headline number. According to some pretty deep research, only 8% of Americans born into the bottom fifth of the income ladder actually make it all the way to the top fifth. 8%. Just let that sink in for a second.
But how does that 8% compare to other places? Well, it turns out that in countries like Canada or Denmark, your odds of making that same rags to riches leap are actually quite a bit higher. So the very story that America is so famous for is, statistically speaking, more likely to happen somewhere else.
And this table really shows us why. Just look at the top and bottom rows. More than a third of kids born at the very top stay at the top, and more than a third of kids born at the bottom stay at the bottom. Economists have a great name for this: stickiness at the ends. The middle, though, is a whole different story. It's much more fluid. People there have a pretty equal shot of moving up, moving down, or just staying put.
So why does that stickiness happen? What are the things that make it so hard to move from the very bottom to the very top and vice versa?
Well, economists have a term for it, of course. It's called intergenerational persistence. It's basically the idea that your economic status, whether you're rich or poor, tends to get passed down from one generation to the next, not just through money, but through a whole bunch of advantages or disadvantages.
And here's kind of how it works. Wealthier parents can invest way more in their kids' development, better schools, healthcare, you name it. That gives their kids a massive head start. That's why things are so sticky at the top. But down at the bottom, people run into all sorts of barriers, like not being able to get a loan or finding good schools, and that makes it incredibly difficult to climb up. So you end up with this pattern, a really dynamic middle, but very little movement at the extremes.
Okay, so if the data shows that mobility is pretty limited, especially at the ends, then why is the rags to riches idea still so incredibly powerful in our culture? And this brings us right to the core paradox. On one hand, you have the belief. A poll of 27 nations found that Americans were the most likely to agree that people get rewarded for their intelligence and skill. But on the other hand, you have the reality we just looked at. The US actually has less upward mobility from the bottom than places like Canada and Western Europe.
There's a huge disconnect between the national story and the numbers.
Part of the reason for this disconnect has a name. It's called survivorship bias. It's our natural human tendency to focus on the dramatic successes, the John Coombs and the Chris Gardners, and completely ignore the huge number of people who worked just as hard but didn't make it. We celebrate the survivors, and they end up becoming the whole story in our minds.
And this isn't just a weird psychological quirk. It actually serves a social purpose. As sociologists pointed out decades ago, if you give a ton of publicity to these amazing success stories, it helps keep the collective belief in opportunity alive. These stories become cultural touchstones that keep the dream going, even when the reality is a lot more complicated.
So this leaves us with a final, fundamental question. The rags to riches narrative is inspiring, it's powerful, and it's deeply woven into the culture. The data, however, paints a much more complex picture. So what does it mean when a nation's most cherished story doesn't quite match its own data?